this is the time when the British government is nationalising left, right and centre. So it didn't seem that extraordinary. It seems in hindsight extraordinary.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Few figures in 20th century Australia have inspired such enduring affection and debate as Joseph Benedict Chifley. The Bathurst boy who rose from railwayman to Prime Minister embodied the Labor movement's most powerful myths: hard work, humility and service to the common good. Yet as historian David Day shows in his acclaimed biography, Chifley, A Life, the man behind the legend was far more complex, pious yet unorthodox, frugal yet ambitious, idealistic yet pragmatic. Chifley's story is one of extraordinary perseverance. He had a childhood marked by Irish poverty, almost. He had a career shaped by the bitter 1917 railway strike and a political life defined by both loyalty and loss. As Treasurer and then Prime Minister, he presided over Australia's post-war reconstruction, ushering in full employment, immigration and the foundations of our modern welfare state. But he also risked it all and paid the price on the ill-fated attempt to nationalise the banks. Today, I'm lucky enough to revisit that transformative era and Ben Chifley's story with David Day, author of Chifley, A Life and one of Australia's foremost historians. Welcome to Afternoon Light. Again, your second appearance, David, so wonderful to have you here.
Georgina.
Well, David, I think the blurb of your book describes Chifley as arguably 20th century Australia's greatest and most popular Prime Minister. I mean, we're sitting here at the Robert Menzies Institute, so some may say that's contested, and I know a lot of people deeply admire John Curtin, of course, Howard and Hawke and Keating are figures of the latter 20th century, but deeply admired by people today. Where do you think the average, say, let's start with a Labor supporter, would rank Chifley compared to their other greats?
Well, he always will suffer from not dying in office, as it were, as Prime Minister. And increasingly, of course, as time goes on, he slips into the shadows for a lot of people. So you ask the average Australian and they would struggle to know who Chifley was, I think. But, a dyed-in-the-wool Labor supporter would certainly have a good idea of Chifley. But, of course, because Curtin died in harness during wartime, he was seen as having sacrificed himself as much as a soldier had. And there's a lot of truth in that. But nevertheless, Chifley gave so much of himself to the Labor movement over his entire life and died, with a heart attack as opposition leader, confident that he could have gone on, to reclaim office. But we'll explore that later, I guess.
And, these are all those hypotheticals that...
So I think, in brief answer, I think Curtin would still stand out more. Hawke certainly admired Curtin, partly because, of course, he'd seen him in Perth as a boy. He'd seen Curtin. But also because he was a reformed alcoholic. So he identified with Curtin in that sense.
I think Chifley has a sort of quintessential Labor man story too, Labor PM story from the real working class background, Irish Catholic background, pulls himself out of, a Watland dorm hut. He had been a worker, he'd been a train driver and then a fireman because, of course, of the strike. But that sense that he encapsulated a lot of what people in the past, not so much today, but people in the past would have thought was quintessential Labor.
Yes, he led a real life. He worked his way up to being a train driver, which was almost an aristocrat of the working class, and then got demoted because of the 1917 strike. So he could relate to people in a way I think that other leaders like Hawke and even somebody like Whitlam, of course, who had a much different upbringing and background to someone like Chifley.
It seems to me that Chifley was formed, his views and what he stood for was really formed by a few seminal influences in his life. His upbringing, which was tough, the 1917 strike, and then I think his sort of contest and combative interactions with Lang, and then being appointed to the Royal Commission in the 30s on banking. These sort of moments really, really shape his trajectory to the prime ministership. If we start off with his childhood, I mean, it's a difficult set of circumstances he finds himself in. I mean, I don't get a sense that he ever complained about it or begrudged his parents, but he was dealt a pretty tough hand, I thought.
Yeah, I'm still curious about what actually happened. He was sent off to live with his grandfather and his auntie, and one presumes it was to help his grandfather, who lived on a small property outside of Bathurst. So it was beyond easy reach of Chifley, who was very young at the time, to see his parents. And that would have been really tough. One must presume he'd have sense of rejection by his parents, because it's not clear why they sent him off other than to help the grandfather, who may have been struggling.
So he's sent off at 5 in 1890. He's born in 1885. And, I mean, he describes his grandfather as an old Tartar, which doesn't evoke kind of cuddles and, cups of hot chocolate and books by the fire at night, does it?
Yeah. When I was, researching the book, I went out to lime kilns and found the property where he lived, which was, just a ruin. Now, I think the chimney might have still been, or part of it was still standing, and a few old fruit trees around. And Chifley's job when he got home from school and on weekends would have been to do the chores, to get the firewood, to deal with any animals that were kept there. And it would have been a sort of a loveless life in a way, one suspects.
That's my reading of it. He gets a very rudimentary education while he's out in lime kilns, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Was that typical of a working class boy?
Well, I mean, what wasn't typical was from somebody from an Irish Catholic background being sent to a state school. That was atypical, but it was close by the grandfather's house. There were Catholic schools that he could have been sent to, but it would have been more difficult. He would have had to, I guess, when he was younger, have been taken there by his grandfather, which wasn't going to happen, I don't think. And later, he could have perhaps ridden a horse. Some people from lime kilns did go to those schools, but it wasn't to be for him. And I think perhaps there wasn't such a deep attachment to the Catholic Church as one might have imagined.
Yeah. I mean, later in life, he doesn't ever say I'm agnostic, but he certainly doesn't seem to be a very spiritual, deeply religious person.
No, and he marries outside the church. Which was quite a radical thing to do at the time.
In terms of his sympathy for the Labor movement, do you see some, I guess, seeds germinating through his childhood living in quite difficult conditions in lime kilns and the poverty he was experiencing?
Yeah, and I think everybody around there would have been Labor sympathisers, one suspects. So it would have seemed just natural to him, and particularly that Labor's policies would be directed towards people like his grandfather, people on small blocks of land, people struggling. Yeah.
He had a moment, I think he submits an essay for a competition, I think commemorating the 8-hour day organised by the local union committee, and he wins the essay prize, £5, which no doubt was quite a lot of money. And his father predicts on that day he wins the prize that he would one day be Prime Minister. So there was something in his early character that was prime ministerial that showed some leadership.
Look, anytime a kid speaks up, your father probably said that you were going to be Prime Minister 100 times.
Yeah.
So it's not unusual that occasionally they'll be right. So it would have been difficult, particularly, given that trajectory that he followed into the railways, becoming a train driver. I don't think Chifley would have predicted it at the time, until later in life.
The other very important event in his childhood is, of course, the 1890s crash and, a real depression in Australia and people doing it very tough. And he would have, as a child, observed that. Did that instill in him a real concern about helping people in poverty?
Yeah. Look, I don't think that would have had as much effect as it would have on Curtin, growing up in inner Melbourne. But growing up in the lime kilns where you're sort of quarantined from that, really. Depression, when you're living on the land, a drought is going to be of more effect than a depression for somebody like Chifley's grandfather.
As you said before, he marries, I think Lizzie Mackenzie is his wife, who's the daughter of a train worker, so same industry, and marries outside of his church, marries a Presbyterian, not a Catholic. And that is
a staunch Presbyterian as well.
Yeah. And in direct defiance of the prohibition on marrying outside of the faith that the Catholic Church has put out. And I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong. Ne temere, is that the prohibition? I'm not Catholic, and I don't speak Latin, so I'm failing on all counts here.
Yeah.
But, did that show that he was willing to push against authority, do you think? Or, was there a meaning we can draw from his marriage to Lizzie?
It's love, mate.
Yeah, just loved her.
Love will out. He obviously met her through the father and fell in love with her. And, he was prepared to bear the consequences of that in terms of his membership of the Catholic Church. So he would still go to church occasionally, but have to sit down the back or choose to sit down the back.
Marriage never produced children. And Lizzie famously really stays in Bathurst when Chifley enters politics. He lives at the Currajong Hotel, which exists to this day, a site of some interesting political episodes, of course, through history. And he takes with him instead his sort of long-term secretary, Phyllis Donnelly, to Canberra, who stays with him, I think, till the very end of his life. And she's a secretary for him in Bathurst as well. There's allegations that he had a long-term affair with Phyllis Donnelly. How does that marry with his Catholic faith, or was it just typical of men of that day? Or
well, no, it was typical.
It's men of any day, people of any day, I guess.
Yeah,
without being too puritanical about these things.
One of the most momentous discoveries that I made when I was researching the book was going through the sideboard of their house in Busby Street and
this is Busby Street in Bathurst.
Bathurst, yeah. So this tiny little terrace that he lived in, or was his house until the end of his life, and pulling out from the bottom drawer X-rays of his wife's spine. So she had quite terrible scoliosis that caused considerable pain to her. So the extent to which, they had a normal marital relationship, as it were, and quite often as Prime Minister he would be going off in one direction and she would be going off in another to holiday separately with a friend.
Right.
And I think it was the marriage became keeping up appearances in a small town, but people knew, could see behind the curtains, as it were.
Yeah.
And he sort of lived in a separate room in the house. When he slept there, he slept in a separate room.
Yeah.
And, it's a small town. Well, not that small, but it's small enough. And even when I was doing the research, people were very circumspect about what they were prepared to say, that they knew things but they wouldn't say.
Because of their deep respect for him as an individual, they didn't want to be engaged in gossip or...
Well, the family, parts of the family, extended family are still there. A nephew was a Catholic priest there who was a great defender of Chifley and denied anything salacious about him, whether he had other relationships. So, yeah.
It becomes a train driver, which is, as you say, is the king of the working class, a very, very significant position. And his parents-in-law give him and Lizzie the house, or at least the tenancy to the house. So they're reasonably well off for people of their situation in life. But the 1917 railway strike really is in my view, this sort of critical moment that turns him into a politician, basically. I mean, he's involved in his union, but it's his sort of moment where he's, I guess, activated.
Yeah, he was hard done by,
yeah,
as many of his fellow strikers were as well.
Why was that strike so divisive, do you think, David?
Well, it's against the background of the war.
Yes. So we're in the middle of this First World War.
So Conservative politicians were looking to pick a fight with Labor, and no quarter was to be given. So Chifley paid a big price for that because he'd worked his way up to be a train driver, and you can imagine driving one of those big, powerful trains across the mountains as he did. It would have been a thrilling thing to do. And to be reduced then to being a fireman, to shoveling coal into the firebox would have been quite humiliating, I think, for Chifley.
Yeah. So he's dismissed from being a train driver and then demoted, basically, as many other people were. After the strike breaks, he maintains his links to the union and sort of keeps it going against all odds. I think basically the union was deregistered, so he's trying to keep the momentum going. I mean, what does that show about him, do you think, this sort of commitment to trade union activism and trade union politics?
He was very attached to the people of Bathurst, to ordinary people, and, wanted, I think, to raise people up. As Prime Minister, he would be driven back to Bathurst on weekends. And rather than sitting in an electoral office, he would sit on the steps of the Bathurst Times and just speak to anyone who came up.
Right. So he was a politician in the making.
Yeah. I mean, as Prime Minister, he would do this, which was really pretty extraordinary. But it sort of gives an insight. I mean, it was a genuine thing. He wasn't playing politics. Hawke later, would mix with a lot of people at the races and take down their stories on a bit of paper and put it in his pocket, and then when he got away, he'd just throw these things all away rather than following them up. But Chifley would follow things up and would answer the queries and the concerns of people in his electorate.
He enters politics 11 years after the strike in 1928, and this is sort of in the context of Jack Lang, the Premier of New South Wales, causing a whole lot of problems for Labor. We end up with the Lang Labor Party and the other Labor Party. The Jack Lang context is pretty instrumental in Chifley's political career. Can you describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sort of populism was anathema to Chifley, although he did, succumb to it a bit in the late 20s over the topic of immigration. It was a time when people were bringing out groups of mainly Italian workers to work, fencing in the countryside and on other pursuits. And Chifley sort of expressed opposition to that.
Yes.
And he also came out very much in favour of white Australia at this time in a way that Curtin wasn't. So there was a real distinction between the two of them.
And why do you think that was? Was it because of his concern about racial purity, or was it concern about the competition that migrants would present to Australian workers?
Yeah, it was a matter of working conditions.
Right.
It was believed, as it had been right back into the 19th century, that the introduction of foreign workers would erode the hard-won working conditions of Australians, which led the world in many respects, with We're sitting in the building that created the 8-hour day.
Yeah.
So these things, the 44-hour week, these things really seemed quite revolutionary at the time.
Yeah.
And by bringing in gangs of workers to undercut the wages, and wages of rural workers could be quite lucrative as well, shearers and such forth. So if you brought in foreign workers, it would really be a threat to that.
He was very close to James Scullin, a Labor Prime Minister, and he was Minister for Defence in his government and supported this Premier's plan to try and help Australia get through the Great Depression, which was, of course, condemned by the New South Wales Premier Jack Lang, who just wanted to repudiate Australia's debts to the UK. He felt New South Wales, in the Lang case, should be looking after citizens there, not paying money to a foreign government. But there were concerns that Australia's sovereign debt became a sovereign debt risk. I mean, a Lang candidate contributes to Chifley losing his seat at the 1931 election to a UAP candidate. The animosity between Chifley and Lang must have been pretty high, but he ends up being a bit of a peacemaker, doesn't he?
Well, he continues with the Federal Labor Party. So he stands...
not the Lang Labor.
Not Lang Labor.
Yeah.
So it's not only Lang Labor that's providing a threat to the Federal Labor Party, but also the Communist Party, which really reaches its high point in the 30s as well. So Chifley, in New South Wales at least, was a rather lonely political figure.
And just on the Communist Party support, why was it so high in the 30s? Was there a sense that we needed a revolution and the proletariat to rise up in Australia?
Things were incredibly tough.
The economic conditions were so bad that people were driven to the extremes.
Yeah, and people looked to Russia at the time, which seemed to be providing an answer for people who were doing it tough in Australia. So it wasn't an incredible development. It seemed quite a natural development at the time and kept going, during the war as well, when Russia became Australia's ally. And the terrible things that happened in Russia during this time didn't really become known until the 1950s. So Russia seemed like a workers' paradise.
Yes.
The sort of workers' paradise that Australia had been in the 1900s.
So people thought it was the Russian approach was an
people were
approach
losing,
that was going to deliver for their aspirations.
People were losing their houses, their jobs, and the Communist Party was, organising and standing up against evictions and people doing it tough. So, I'm not sure what their vote was. I can't remember now off the top of my head, but they did really well then and then during the war as well.
Chifley's out of Parliament from 1931 until the early 40s, so he's just a normal member of society, but still obviously very politically engaged. What was that wilderness years, the 10 wilderness years, I guess you could call them, the decade of the wilderness, like for him?
Yeah. Well, he couldn't have had any certainty that he would ever get back. I mean, the idea that he would, one day be Prime Minister must have seemed incredible to him. But he kept the Labor faith in that sense and stayed true to his beliefs and ideals right through that really tough period when Lang was quite ascendant. And the Communist Party was proving also a thorn in Labor's side.
I mean, he takes it right up to Lang, doesn't he? In May 1935, he actually contests Lang's own seat of Auburn. Doesn't win.
But he's not a shrinking violet.
No. He wasn't well educated in terms of a traditional education through schools and university. He doesn't go to university, of course, but he's an autodidact, isn't he?
Yes,
he yearns for information and reads and absorbs the ideas of economists and of history and the like. Through that decade do you see him building a political philosophy?
It's difficult to say, I think, but he was really at the cutting edge of new ideas in the early 30s. He's reading Keynes at a time when others weren't. So he's out in front of a lot of conventional politicians and economists as well in terms of developing ideas about how to fix the Depression. But of course, he's out of power.
Is he writing, or he's making speeches outside of Bathurst around New South Wales? Yeah. Because he comes to the attention of Richard Casey and Robert Menzies, of course, and they appoint him to the Royal Commission in 1936 on the banking system. They would have known he was a Labor man and very much a Labor man, but he was sort of seen as a Labor moderate, a Labor man who they could deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's important to have Labor people in on inquiries like that in order to make sure that they will get accepted and endure long term. So that's not really surprising. Hawke, as trade union leader, was brought in on inquiries as well.
It's interesting too, even before he contests the 41 election, Menzies is appointing him Director of Labour Supply and Regulation to this new Ministry of Munitions. So, the Menzies government and the Lyons government beforehand really saw Chifley as someone they could deal with despite his political allegiances.
Yeah.
And he was obviously congenial with them. You can see that, as we'll discuss later, the way Menzies speaks of Chifley after his death, that those relationships across party lines he was good at, wasn't he?
Yeah, Canberra was a much more intimate place then.
Yes.
The Conservative MPs tended not to live in the Currajong, but they did socialise a lot. Canberra's a country town, really.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that their relationships with a lot of them would be quite warm across party lines.
He obviously goes on when he's Prime Minister to try and nationalise the banks, which leads to his downfall. Yeah. But when he's on this Banking Royal Commission, do you get a sense that that's the direction he wants to go in?
Well, the problem that Labor wrestles with, right through so many Labor governments, is the restrictions of the Constitution, which was done without any Labor input.
Yeah.
In terms of drawing up the Constitution, though, Labor, it was before Labor was of any huge significance in parliaments in Australia, despite having a short-term government in Queensland, which lasted a week, I think. So every time Labor gets in, Fisher tried it 3 times, I think, to get amendments to the Constitution, to have referenda. And the Australian people generally rejected it each time.
Yeah.
And so Chifley is very aware of this. And in the context of the Depression, when the banks tended to take a very conservative view of how Australia was to get out of the Depression, that it had to be through sacking people, reducing social welfare benefits, things like that, to reduce expenditure rather than grow the economy. So the idea of actually controlling the banks, controlling money supply, which then was in the hands of the private banks, would have appealed to somebody like Chifley, who was, au fait with new and relatively radical economic ideas propagated by Keynes.
He was also a supporter of centralisation of power in the Commonwealth, wasn't he? He was not a states' rights person. So, we see that with his push for referendum that give the federal government much more power. And he's, continues, I think, a tradition of Labor Prime Ministers in pushing for that. He comes to the Prime Ministership sadly, in a way, because his good friend John Curtin dies in June 1945, and he's the sort of natural successor, isn't he?
he's not the only
No, Frank
possibility.
Ford was there. Poor Frank
Yeah,
Ford.
poor Frank Ford.
Had a few goes, didn't he?
Yeah. But also Everett. Everett would have been keen to take the gig. But there were others as well who could have stepped into that role. But Chifley did it, partly, I think, because of his friendly relationships with other MPs and his long time as treasurer.
Yes.
Which gave him a lot of...
Yeah, so he's John Curtin's treasurer through the period John Curtin's in office, 41 to 45. So that would have given him a really deep understanding of the domestic economic agenda.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Curtin's naturally very focused on outside of Australia, what's going on World War II, and leaves Chifley really to run domestic
to find
policy.
the money.
Yeah, the money. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it strikes me as strange that Chifley doesn't attend John Curtin's funeral in Perth, despite their friendship and his role as his treasurer. I mean, the explanation is he needed to secure the numbers for taking over the leadership, but still, this is a poignant moment.
Yeah, it was. There were two things. I think perhaps it would have been very difficult for him emotionally. But at the same time, he was, I think, resentful of Curtin towards the end.
Right.
The Curtin had, heart failure and was getting sicker and sicker and less able to perform the role of Prime Minister, but refused to resign. And I think that annoyed Chifley. And finally, once he died, Chifley's view was, at last, he can take over.
Was there a sense too that he needed to take the leadership in the Prime Ministership because he had to save Australia from Doc Everett? Which he did.
Yeah. Yes. I think he had few illusions about Everett. This mercurial character that who had a rather sad end, but he realised, I think, that Everett would not have been a good Prime Minister. He made some incredible contributions as Foreign Minister.
Yes.
But he didn't have it within him, I don't think, to be a good Prime Minister in terms of relating to ordinary people.
How much of that post-war reconstruction agenda do we attribute to Chifley? I mean, the war is ending. We all know it's ending. Curtin is starting to make plans for what happens next. But is it Chifley really who sets the policy agenda with his, Keynesian ideas and ideas around immigration and taxation and obviously banking, the social welfare state?
It's easy to sort of put it all on Chifley or put it all on Curtin. But these guys are leading governments of some talent. There were some real drop kicks in there as well. But there were some really quite talented visionary people within the Curtin and Chifley governments. And in terms of immigration, it was just a no-brainer. We had come close to being invaded. There was a real agreement across the political divide that Australia was too unpopulated, too lightly populated to be able to hold on to the continent in the long term. And in the post-war period, of course, when you start seeing decolonisation and quite large and powerful countries emerging from this process of decolonisation. And strangely, strange to us now, but Chifley saw India as a big danger to Australia, possibly.
Less so Japan.
Yeah, less so Japan, of course, because it's occupied, it's under American control. And Japan is unlikely to rise again in a way that will challenge Australia. But India, it's in turmoil from 1947, and it's the biggest country in our region. So Chifley is very much in favour of decolonisation and very much in favour of creating strong links between Australia and these new countries, which is, really quite progressive for Australians of that period.
Yeah.
So, he supports the independence of Indonesia. He refuses Britain's request to send troops to Malaya and sees, a strong Indonesia as a bulwark against a possible Indian invasion of Australia down the track.
Yeah, which is at odds with a lot of the views of the time that Indonesia was the next yellow peril for Australia. The threat from the north would come from Indonesia.
I'm not sure that people thought that at the time. I don't get much sense of that because Indonesia was not militarily strong, the independent Indonesia, and had enough internal problems to keep them occupied for a long time. But it was, I think, India that bulked large in Chifley's mind for a time. It provided a huge army in the Second World War to the British Empire, and it was just such a big, apparently overcrowded country that Australia's empty spaces would have looked attractive.
As we get out of World War II, Chifley's Prime Minister, and we start to deal with the early stages of the Cold War, was he reluctant to found intelligence services like ASIO or sort of embrace that kind of Cold War mindset that was developing, the threat from global communism domestically but also internationally, domino theory and the like?
It took a while for that to happen. I mean, Australia with Evatt and Chifley coming out of the war, I wrote an article about this, Australia perhaps developing a little sub-empire of its own after the war. So they take on 2 British aircraft carriers as the nucleus of a post-war Australian Navy that will be able to hold sway over its region, everywhere from Singapore around to Fiji, I guess. And in the United Nations, where they're supporting middle countries in the United Nations, places like Brazil, trying to develop them as a voice against superpowers. So the effect of the Second World War was not to draw, it seems, looking back, this drew Australia and America together. And Curtin invites America in to help protect us because there was nobody else going to do it. Yeah. But when they get here, of course, the Americans are looking around and thinking about post-war economic arrangements and trying to cement things in place that will allow American capital to have a strong place in Australia. And this is seen as a big threat by Curtin and by Chifley. They want to control Australian Airlines and things like that, the supply of aircraft to Australian Airlines, and keep Australian Airlines quite weak. So when Australia emerges from the war, it decides, well, we're not going to be part of an American empire, and they oppose America trying to set up a base in Manus. And they sort of go back as a more independent member of the British Empire, but a much more forthright and a member that will speak up more and be respected more.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, someone who has Irish Catholic heritage, that he ends up being, fiercely loyal to the British Empire post-war, to Britain. But I guess that's in the context of Australians saw themselves as British subjects. Yes. And he had a scepticism towards the US that perhaps is not part of his reputation.
Yeah, and that's, I think, why he had trouble sort of adopting that Cold War mindset, really, until quite late, until he saw the political effects of it as that started to impinge on politics. And, Russia started to become more of a threat in the world, with Berlin and such forth, and Churchill's speech about the Iron Curtain. So, that sort of changes thinking in Australia and changes with Chifley as well. I mean, I don't think he was as fleet-footed as he needed to be then. I mean, he's getting older and, of course, he's suffering from heart problems as well.
Yeah. So he takes over from Curtin in 45 and then they contest the 46 election as leader of the Labor Party, as Prime Minister. Menzies had set up the Liberal Party in 44 and then leads them to the 46 election, which he had hopes of winning and they don't. Labor's returned with a reduced majority, but still a majority. So would have, for Chifley, I guess, have been at least a sense that he's elected with pretty good support of the Australian public.
Yes.
Perhaps not as much as Curtin had received at the 43 election. But, I mean, Chifley is intent on bank nationalisation. He's obviously maintaining wartime controls, which is a burden for the Australian public. Do you think that he risked everything for bank nationalisation? Was it his absolute, core policy belief he had to get it done?
He was committed to it, and obviously I don't think it was the total reason for his failure at the 1949 election. I think one of the problems was that at the 46 election, while he lost 6 seats in the lower house, he got an overwhelming victory in the Senate. So, 33 seats to 3, and that can go to your head.
I see. Yeah.
So it's always a risk. It seems nice on the night to get a strong result, but you've really got to keep your feet on the ground.
Yeah.
And, Chifley had dreams of what Australia might become and, of course, of a powerful federal government sort of being able to implement that vision. And it did require power over money supply and power over credit and things like that. So it required much more power over banks in some way. And this is the time when the British government is nationalising left, right and centre. So it didn't seem that extraordinary. It seems in hindsight extraordinary. This was a misstep by Chifley, but it was in some senses going along with the temper of the times for Labor parties at least.
There is an analysis that we've talked about on this podcast that the Chifley actually makes the Liberal Party into a serious political party and contributes to its success and now longevity because of the bank nationalisation issue, that if the Liberal Party had lost the 49 election, then it might have gone the way of the UAP and the Nationalists. I mean, do you accept that as a thesis?
Yeah, it wasn't only that, though. Of course, there was also the coal strike and sending the army in to break the strike was seen as anathema by a lot of Labor supporters. This is something a Conservative government would do. So when you're going into an election, you really need the enthusiasm of your supporters. And in a way, that sort of diminished the enthusiasm of Labor supporters in the 49 election. And bank nationalisation, that became a big popular thing as the banks sort of sent out their staff to organise amongst their customers and create fears. But at the same time, there was also similar sorts of fears being created by doctors, that feared that there was going to be a national health service, as in Britain. So people were, while they might have embraced that in the 1930s, in the 1940s, when you're coming out of the war, you've got lots of savings, you want to spend them, you can't spend them, everything. Well, not everything, but a lot of things are still being rationed.
Yeah.
There's all these animal spirits that want to be released. And Chifley seems to be saying, no, we'll tell you what to do and when you can do it.
Yeah.
So, people turned against that sort of idea. But he didn't accept that Labor's days were done. He couldn't accept that Labor would be out of office for a long time. He thought he could fight his way back and that people would reject Liberal politics.
Well, I mean, he was proved entirely wrong, of course, and the coalition
not in his lifetime.
Not in his lifetime, true, but I'm sure he would have been appalled to think it was 23 years until Labor was back in power. He dies suddenly, although he had, as you said, health problems in 1951 in Canberra on the night of the Commonwealth Jubilee Ball, and the message is received in Parliament House, and Menzies breaks the news to those in attendance and actually then dissolves the ball, says, we can't continue to celebrate this given what has just happened. Menzies' broadcast following Chifley's death is full of admiration and respect for Chifley. It's a broadcast that we would do well to remember for the sense of, I guess, is completely non-partisan. It was recognising an important Australian,
yes,
whatever the politics of the day. Menzies says,
Thankfully, we've still got that sort of.
Well,
I think perhaps not quite as much. But,
we should have more of it, though. I think. I mean, he talks about Chifley having in abundance those human qualities of easy informality, of deep conviction, of quiet humour, and of engaging frankness, which made him, in the old phrase, a man's man. He set a high example of great ability and devotion and industry. He was a good Australian. He was a good man.
Yeah, I mean, there was a real friendship between the two of them, I think. And it may have been partly because Chifley thought he had Menzies' measure.
Yeah.
And, that was an easy assumption to make after the 46 election and, Menzies' failure during the war. It's hard to imagine that he would have a second life that would last so long.
Yeah.
But such it was. And Chifley couldn't accept it. He thought, the following election that he would get back into power. And we'll never know.
We will never know. I mean, I could ask you, do you think he'd have won that next election? But you just don't know. And there was, of course, rising Cold War concerns that meant that Chifley would have had to have handled the politics of that. And anyway, he left Everett to do that, and do that very badly.
Yes, he would have handled it so much better than Everett. But whether he could have won, I'm not sure. And as you say, we'll never know. But I mean, there were significant economic problems that he could have built a campaign on.
Yes.
But whether he could have got over the line is another question.
Well, David Day, thank you so much for talking to us about Ben Chifley, a good man, a good Australian, an important Australian. It's been great to have you once again on Afternoon Light.
Yeah, it was a wonderful task writing this book. I loved it immensely.
It's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.